Hello, welcome to the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson, and I'm joined as always by the Observer's Fiona Maddocks and the Spectator's Richard Bratby. Our top 5 this week may well be the most difficult so far, especially for Fiona and Richard, I feel. Top 5 works for string quartet. It's often said that a composer will save their most intimate and personal music for the string quartet. Fascinating that that particular lineup of 2 violins, viola and cello so often brings out the very best that a composer has to offer. Smetana perhaps summed it up for a lot of composers when describing his quartet, From My Life, a work which in a sense is private and therefore written for 4 instruments which should converse together in an intimate circle about the things which so deeply trouble me, nothing more. A sentiment probably shared with a number of works we'll be discussing today. But it's not all 4-string doom and gloom, though. Perhaps a more practical description of the quartet comes from all people, Goethe. You listen to 4 sensible persons conversing, you profit from their discourse, and you get to know the peculiar properties of their several instruments. No arguing with Goethe. Now, our special guest today is someone who spent 20 years conversing with 3 other persons, although whether they were all sensible is up for debate. It's Robben Island, viola player of one of the finest string quartets this country has ever produced, and that's definitely not up for debate, the Lindsays. The quartet disbanded in 2005. Since then, Robben has appeared as a soloist, led viola sections in various orchestras, continued as a teacher, and is currently head of chamber music at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. Robben, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Tell me about being in a quartet. Is it the way in which, do you feel it with the music that you played, that it is the way in which Smetana perhaps described it, and then also in that rather sort of bald way that Goethe described it?
Well, it's part of it for sure, but it's just so many things. I mean, one of the things that used to be said about string quartet playing was that it was all the difficulties of a marriage without the sort of positive aspects of it. Uh, but in fact, every quartet finds its own way of dealing with the difficulties, and certainly with the Lindsays, we were 4 very different personalities, and we had often very different views of things and felt things differently. But there was a very conscious and strong sense that the composer came first, and that we really, really wanted to put aside anything that got in the way. And I mean, interestingly, over and over again, my recollection is that we would actually not resolve differences in a rehearsal. And it was initially quite scary for me. You know, they'd been going on for 20 years before I joined them. And then I sort of realized that there was some strange kind of alchemy that happened between that lack of resolution and the concert. And only in the concert, everybody was clearly wanting to make it work. And I think there was that sense of something richer and more than the sum of the parts that hopefully came across, and I think that is one of the characteristics of a really fine quartet, and it's quite mysterious. You can't always say why or how it works.
Now, of course, you had this situation, you knew that the quartet was going to finish at some point. What was that like as 4 people who'd spent so much time together with the knowledge that you weren't going to anymore?
Well, Peter Cropper announced 3 years before the finish date, as it were, that he decided he wanted to stop. So, I mean, it may be the only time that a serious string quartet has planned 3 years in advance to stop in that way. And I mean, he gave us the option, considering to find another first violinist. But I think, I mean, the quartet had been together for 40 years. It was a bit like, I don't want to make a direct comparison with the Amadeus, but when Peter Shidloff died, I don't think they ever considered for a moment that they would carry on without him. And certainly, I mean, Peter's character was irreplaceable. I think, in fact, it was an incredibly liberating experience those last 3 years. Of course, full of sadness and sort of concerns for the future, but more than anything, a sense of every concert is going to count. I mean, it really was like that, and especially the last year when we had something ridiculous like 150 concerts, including several Beethoven cycles and so on. And I mean, the energy that we found and wanted to put into everything was just extraordinary. I think we all shared that. And well, I remember obviously very well our very last performance of Beethoven's last quartet. I was 135, muss es sein, es muss sein, must it be, it must be. And, you know, just watching the bars diminish, I think we're getting closer and closer to never actually playing again. And yet we were playing as well as we'd ever played ever. So it was very, very poignant, actually, extraordinary sensation. Yeah.
Incredible.
Mhm.
Now, what about this task I set you for choosing 5 string quartets? How easy or difficult has it been for you?
Well, in the end, I did it quite quickly. And initially, I was thinking, well, am I going just for what everybody would agree are the greatest quartets? You know, you can't leave out Death and the Maiden sort of thing. And then I thought, I've ended up with two, which almost everybody would agree are among the very, very greatest, and three which have got a more personal reason for being chosen. And they came quite quickly. And what's been interesting is actually noticing why I chose them and the things that they might have in common or they don't have in common, and so on. So, in fact, contrary to the idea of Smetana's idea that it's you know, you're getting there to, as a composer, to express your most difficult experiences. At least three of these pieces that I've chosen are quite the contrary, and
Yes.
you know, again, whether unconsciously because of the time we're living in, I wanted a bit of, not exactly light relief, but just a reminder of the sort of more joyful aspects of life.
Yes.
That's what I've done.
Quite
So,
right. I want to hear your first choice, Robin. It doesn't
okay,
matter which order you do them in.
well, I'm just going to do it chronologically in terms of when it was written.
Hmm.
So, I mean, Haydn, it has to be Haydn. I mean, I couldn't leave out Haydn, but, you know, which one do you choose? And it has to have a personal reason for it, I suppose. I've always loved the Opus 20 set, which is often considered to be his first really great set, although he did write some fine quartets before it. One sort of assumes that he must have been a young thing, but in fact he was already in his 40s when he got to that, and all the other 60 or 70, I always forget how many it is, quartets that come after that. You know, he was right up to close to the end of his life. The Opus 20s, all of them are just sort of full of invention, and I think the reason I chose this is because this particular quartet in C major, Opus 20 number 2, has a quality of kind of going backwards, collecting lots of wonderful things from the Baroque period, and as well as being full of extraordinary sort of premonitions for the future. And it's sort of bringing together so many different aspects. For instance, the last movement is a fully fledged fugue, and at the time Haydn was writing that, you know, the Galant, the Rococo period was very much that sort of rather frivolous, light-hearted way of composing, where you generally are not touching the deepest of feelings. So just the fact of going back and using a fugue, but actually treating it very, very light-heartedly in a certain sense, brilliantly, virtuosically, but light-heartedly. So that was how he chose to finish this particular piece.
How difficult is Haydn to play technically? I would imagine there's going to be some quartets we talk about today that are really, really hard technically, particularly the more modern pieces. But Haydn just sounds so easy in that, you know what I mean when I say that, because it's such a pleasure to listen to. But what are the challenges as a player?
Well, it's having the right sort of techniques to characterize all the accompaniment parts. I mean, I'm not sure I should really tell this story, but I did some teaching at the Menuhin School of chamber music. I was standing in for a year and teaching Haydn quartets. And these violinists who were absolutely able to play Paganini standing on their heads had considerable difficulty actually playing just the simplest accompaniment figures. So I would say that the sort of technical aspects of playing quartets generally, but including the early classical repertoire, is just that, yeah, there may well be techniques that you don't learn when you're practicing your scales or practicing your concertos and so on. And you need a huge range of color and sophisticated bow techniques and so forth in order to catch all the nuance, I would say, which again, normally you don't need as a soloist in the same way because you're playing so loud, you're playing with an orchestra behind you or even with a pianist or whatever. So yeah, it's a bit different. The first violinist, of course, tends to get the lion's share in a lot of the Haydn quartets, although, funnily enough, not in this particular one that I've chosen. It's perhaps one of the reasons I've chosen it.
Well, Richard has a bust of Haydn behind him. Fiona has a score of Haydn behind her. So I'm guessing that Haydn comes up in their choices too. Richard, I'm going to go to you first because you're always sticking up for Haydn in these podcasts anyway. But I would imagine that Haydn was your first port of call.
Oh. Boy, what can you say? I mean, he is Papa Haydn. He's the daddy. I mean, he is the man. He founded the string quartet. He wrote the best quartets. At least 55 works for string quartet by Haydn, which Hans Keller, after years and years of analysis, claimed to be all utterly unique, individual, radical masterpieces. Every one of them can be analysed on those terms. But that's not really the point. I mean, the point is, as Robben says, what do they say? That famous quote about Mozart, it's all too easy for children and too difficult for masters. Haydn, the point is he was writing music to be played and for the players first and foremost. I mean, in that era, you wouldn't distinguish music that you would listen to from music that you would play, certainly not chamber music, and it fulfills all those functions. It's entertaining to listen to, but to play, it is just endless source of delight. I mean, I'm a cellist. People say to me, it must be very boring just plodding away on the bass lines. It's absolute nonsense. Pretty much all of Haydn from Opus 9 onwards, there is not a dull cello part. And in fact, the quartet that Robben just chose opens with this glorious cello solo, which, you know, in the 1770s, 1780s, was not that common a thing in chamber music. Off it goes, just sings up like a lark, like so many other Haydn quartets. And that sense of conversation, I mean, I think I tried to describe this in a recent article I wrote. I said it's like sort of taking part in a scripted conversation in which nonetheless you still feel completely free. The witticism that you always remember 10 minutes after everyone else has gone home is already there on your lips at the right time for you. Everything works perfectly. It's still full of surprises. It feels spontaneous. And yet it's just delight after delight. And I mean, when I first started playing amateur quartets, it was with a gentleman in his 80s, was our viola player who convened the group. I was 17. I think the other players were both in their 60s or 70s. He was in his 80s. He spent his retirement just devoted to chamber music. He had a colossal mound of music in his music room. And every Wednesday morning when I was in my university holidays, we would meet and he'd he would choose a music, no argument, out it would go, and every single time without fail, the first thing we'd arrive and the first thing on sound would be a Haydn quartet. He'd choose one every week. He said, we always begin with Haydn, you always begin with Haydn. It's all there. And as I say, it's not just a delight to play, the music is so radical, it's so inventive. As I think another thing Hans Keller said, I keep coming back to him because he sort of informed my thinking about Haydn a great deal, but I think he said there's actually no innovation of 20th century music and contemporary music that cannot be found anticipated or prefigured somewhere in Haydn. Rhythmic complexity, tone color, extended techniques, it's all there in some form, one way or another, anticipated just in the most playful and effortless way.
Fiona, Haydn for you as well, of course.
I could just sum it up by saying yes. I think it isn't easy. I mean, obviously there's some bits where you have passages that are accompanying that seem to be a limited number of notes in comparison with perhaps later quartets, including Haydn's own. But really, every time you think that, you're wrong-footed, because there are so many little twists and turns, and the elegance and sometimes I know when I first came across Haydn quartets myself, both as a listener and as an attempting player, I'd sometimes look at the way he'd written it out, or it may have been the edition, and I couldn't see where the line was, because he puts so much grace notes and ornaments around the melody that was just a revelation to me, and I realized that it's actually how he writes many of his, particularly the first violin parts. But I'm going to plunge in and say the one that I chose, since we've all obviously got a Haydn choice here, I'm sure, was the Sunrise, Opus 76, number 4, which is, I just chose because I just think it's got such a beautiful quartet, but it's got such a wonderful opening when the first violin rises out of a sort of serene bed of chordal, the other three parts. And then a bit later, the cello does the same thing in answer. And it's just glorious music.
Richard.
It's like Bruckner, isn't it? It's almost like proto Bruckner, that kind of expansive symphonic opening of the. As I say, so much of 19th and 20th century music is anticipated in the Haydn quartets, in every sort of device or technique. And I just wanted to, before it's too late, just to throw in my personal choice out of all of them. I thought I wanted to take the entire Opus 64 set, but if I had to choose just one, it would be the last of the set in E flat major, Opus 64 number 6, which for personal reasons. It's a glorious, serene opening, rather like the Sunrise, but the whole set is slightly more compact, slightly more inward, slightly more chambery than the later quartets that came after it, the fantastic Opus 74 and Opus 76 and Opus 71 sets, which are just on another level of grandeur and scale and public-facing sort of aesthetics.
Yes, Robin.
Well, I just thought, since Richard had mentioned the Opus 64 quartets, he took them with him on his first visit to London, and was asked, when he was asked if he had some quartets, that was what was performed. And it was a big audience and a big place, and they are very intimate quartets. And I imagine perhaps there was some difficulty in them being fully appreciated, because when he went back to London the second time, he came armed with the Opus 71 and 74 quartets, and every one of them begins with a short introduction, which is clearly intended to shut up the audience. So say, right, look, we've started. I don't want you talking while the music really begins. And one of them is just a single chord. Others of them have got slightly more extended introductions, but it's just a little touch makes you realize the kind of realities of what it was actually like, and how chamber music was just beginning then to be performed for a larger number of people. And Haydn responded to that. And indeed, you're right, Richard, all the quartets after that have a larger scale. I think the Opus 76 has probably managed to get the ideal balance in many respects. Yeah.
We can't spend the whole podcast talking about Haydn, Richard, but last thing.
Well, I exactly what Robin said and what Fiona said, really. Just one last thing. I promise I'll stop going on about Haydn, but there is virtually all of his quartets, as was typical for the period, are in sets of 6 or 3. The last set, it might have been 3 or 6. Opus 77 he didn't complete, so it was only 2. But there's one quartet I just have to mention, because no one ever mentioned it and no one ever plays it in concerts, and it is an absolute delight. And I love it, and I've probably played it more than any other Haydn quartet. I've played all the Haydn quartets at one time or another. But Opus 42 in D minor, which stands alone on its own, and it's like a little miniature quartet for beginners. It's like he's written it especially for amateurs. It's it's about 12 minutes long, 4 perfectly crafted movements which have within them everything you want from a Haydn quartet: all the wit, all the invention, all the little harmonic tricks and side slips, perfectly written, completely within the grasp of players up to about grade 4 standards. And apparently, H.C. Robbins Landon thinks he wrote 3 of these for a commission from Spain, and that 2 of them have gone missing. So that means that out there, somewhere in the world, possibly, are 2 absolutely perfect miniature Haydn quartets waiting to be found. And God, I would give almost anything to discover those.
Well, I didn't choose any Haydn because of that typical reason that I knew everyone else would. But what I will say is that as percussionists are very rarely jealous of string players. But what I will say is one of the great joys, I think, of being a string player, amateur or professional, is that you have this astonishing amount of repertoire that you can just pull off the shelf and sit down and play with great joy. And I'm sure that's the case with Haydn quartets. Whether you reach for the greatest of professional performances or just simply want to play them together as a group, it's something percussionists really can't do with much. We know all the gear we need, but also, when I was at college, there were about 20 pieces for percussion ensemble, but at the same time, 10,000 pieces for string quartet. There are, of course, string quartets pieces that do require the players to play percussion instruments as well as their own instruments, or perhaps even just simply play their instruments very percussively. I've got a couple of choices where that applies, but my first choice is going to be Benjamin Britten's second string quartet. I think it's a good time to bring in Britten because, again, it's like Haydn. It's the cleanliness, the economy, and the brilliance of the writing, and the clear writing, and the way in which he so naturally communicates music to an audience. I got to the Britten quartets fairly late on. I suppose I was in my 20s or so when I heard them being performed live. And again, it's one of those pieces, I think we've talked about this before in the podcast, where you come in halfway through listening maybe on Radio 3 and you don't know what the piece is. You think, my goodness, what is this piece? And it turned out to be Britten. I think the second one is probably my favorite. I don't know what your views are on Britten's quartets. But again, Sunny works, but again, but always with something extra in there. I think the second is from the 40s, the mid 40s. So round about the time of Peter Grimes and his big fame starting. But such an immediacy about the musical ideas, and such a brilliant way of communicating instantly with an audience with a sound. And I think with all of my choices have in common this idea of making the string quartet maybe not sound like a string quartet. There's something much more orchestral about that sound there. And Britten was so brilliant at writing for all instruments, but I think particularly strings. And there's a nice little story about John Amos tells about when they were rehearsing, first of all, the quartet number 2. And they rehearsed it. Britten was there, but they rehearsed it at Amos's house, and him and his wife had to sit on the floor because they only had 4 chairs. I rather like that idea. It brings up a lovely image. Anyone else with feelings about Britten's quartets? Fiona?
Yes, I was going to choose Britten Quartet, and he wrote 3 across the expanse of his life, really, one very, very close to the end. And I thought I'd see if anybody chose any other one, because I would quite like to have all 3, but I would perhaps choose the third, which has a deep association with Venice, and in fact the opera Death in Venice, and he was in Venice when he was working on it, and in fact the Amadeus played it either just after he died, they played it publicly. I think he got a private performance. I'm not sure the exact sequence of events, but I think they benefit from being heard as a cycle. Actually, those 3 quartets, they offer everything.
Yeah, and it's just always so great to hear instrumental music by Britten. I mean, I love his operas, his vocal music, and all the rest of it. But just to hear pure instrumental music from Britten is always a joy.
And let's not forget that he was a viola player.
Absolutely, all the best ones were they not, Robin? There is something about that. There's something about being in the middle there, not just literally physically, but also as a voice in the music, that affords people a particular view, insider's view of music, I think, not just as a player, but as composers and arrangers. Many of the great arrangers were viola players as well, I know.
Yeah,
Robin, did you play Britten much?
Oh yes, absolutely. Even though the Lindsays were particularly associated with the other great earlier 20th century composer Michael Tippett. But yes, we certainly played the Brittens, and I think the second quartet has got this huge 15-minute last movement, the chaconne, which of course you can't help relating to the famous Bach chaconne, and it's a monumental piece and very, very deeply felt. I grew up thinking that, what people said about a lot of Benjamin Britten was that he was quite light in a certain sense. I mean, it's obviously not true of the big operas. And because he's got this technical brilliance, his ability to write so well for the instruments, it's easy to to think that it's not deeply soul-searching, but my goodness, that chaconne, this certainly is. Yeah. And incredibly imaginative. And yes, I can say from the inside, and I'm sure Richard would agree, I mean, the writing for strings is absolutely brilliant. It's difficult, but superbly written for the instruments, really. Yeah.
It's quite a common accusation thrown at technically brilliant composers, isn't it? That if they make it sound easy, it can't possibly be heartfelt or meaningful. I mean, Ravel is like that, isn't he? Everyone always said, it was so easy for him. He was a brilliant orchestrator, brilliant writer for instruments, and therefore there wasn't that much beyond that. But that seems like a very odd thing to think for me. Richard, your views on Britten?
Well, as that comment about the brilliance, I mean, Mendelssohn is the case in point there. Mendelssohn's octet is the absolute refutal of that. There's a piece that sounds utterly effortless and plays so beautifully, lies so gloriously under the hands, and yet what a range of subtlety. We're not talking about octets, sorry.
True.
Britten, I say, as Robin says, I mean, it's the technique is phenomenal. I mean, he wrote a lot of little pieces for quartet early in his career, as well as a oboe quartet, which is rather fine, and all sorts of little miniatures, which are all very worth exploring, and the Simple Symphony, which was essentially a string quartet in its original form. I mean, I'm with Fiona. If I had to choose one Desert Island Britten quartet, it would be the third, because I feel that there he does sort of get through to the sort of soul of the medium and find something extremely intimate and personal and strange and subtle. And that is real, absolute chamber music on the highest level. There's no account needs to be made there for technique or sort of slightly orchestral manners in the writing. But on the other hand, I mean, the first, I mean, you listen to the opening of the first quartet, it is high-lying first violin line, just high, gleaming above the horizon of the music. And it's there you are. You're on. It's like one of the sea interludes. You're sort of there on the East Anglian coast. And when you discover he wrote it in California, it's performed at Berkeley University in the middle of the summer for the first commission. And there he is inside this completely different imaginative world. And apparently, the experience of writing that piece pretty much led him back to George Crabbe and to Grimes and back to Britten. It's what sort of prompted him to realise almost he needs to be there. And there is that fantastic sense of place. He's so very, very different from Tippett, of course, who I think approached quartets very, very differently. It's a far, far more serious and central undertaking in his musical life. But I mean, I can't really talk about Tippett when Robin's here. I mean, I hope we will. I hope he will at some point. But we'll see.
Let's see. Robin, what's your second choice?
Well, I'm going to go to the other end of my spectrum and come in with Bartok. Bartok wrote 6 wonderful quartets, again spread right through his life, and along with Shostakovich, unquestionably, those are the 2 greatest string quartet writers of the 20th century. A lot of people still have difficulty with Bartok because his language is so dissonant. I introduced Bartok's 5th quartet, which is the one I've chosen, to some students at the Birmingham Conservatoire just last week. In fact, probably one of the reasons that it came to me, because I just revisited it. And one of them said to me afterwards, well, what I find is that initially I don't like the dissonance, but you kind of get used to it. It just becomes a language that you can accept and work with. And certainly that's my experience. And the dissonance isn't really the point, it's just the language he uses. And he's really, his way of storytelling through music is, well, I mean, he was a great follower of Beethoven beyond a doubt. But of course, the other thing about Bartok is that he loved his native folk music. Indeed, he was one of the first kind of people to go and collect the folk music of Eastern Europe. And this quartet, like most of them, is full of folk music. And yet, Bartok was absolutely the height of his sort of intellectual powers. And this piece has got incredible intellectual virtuosity, which is sort of totally linked in to this folky earthiness as well. And I find it completely exhilarating to listen to as a result. I mean, in fact, we sometimes use the old Greek 4 elements, earth, fire, water, and air, as ways of looking at different qualities, not because those are the real elements anymore, we know that, but they certainly are a way of talking about different qualities of life and music. And Bartok definitely gets all these in hugely here. So, I mean, this music is a lot of it's very dark and yet incredibly exuberant. It's quite demonic. When I was just researching to give a few suggestions to the students in Birmingham, I came across the Zeitmeyer Quartet recording of this, and it is spellbinding. It is for me, I'd never heard anything like it, because of its concept as well as, I mean, there are plenty of quartets who play it brilliantly, but this was absolutely astonishing. So I'd strongly recommend that one to anybody who wanted to give it a try. And they bring a really demonic element to it. They take very fast tempi. Sometimes you can hardly believe this is a quartet playing. It's just extraordinary sort of seascape, landscape, just flashing by at times. And the virtuosity of it is completely exhilarating. I mean, Bartok was an atheist, and yet some of his music has an incredibly spiritual quality. And there's a moment in the second movement, which I'm sure he was inspired to write from Beethoven's Opus 132 quartet with the Heilige Dankgesang, when he's giving thanks for recovering from an illness, when Bartok uses a very simple chorale. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. It's so poignant and so beautiful, and made even more so by this little tiny fragment of the first violin adding a comment, which is actually in the wrong key. So you never quite know how sarcastic Bartok was with sort of when he does this playing between consonants and dissonance, or whether it's more playful. And I mean, at the very, very end of this totally chaotic, crazy, brilliant movement, he suddenly brings in a little folk tune, completely banal. And then he spoils it all because he makes the violin play a semitone in the wrong key. And again, you think, what's he doing? Is this a joke? It's sarcasm. But again, it's one of those astonishing moments in music when you just, even when you know it's coming, you just go, incredible. So that's Bartok's Fifth Quartet for me.
I had his fourth quartet on my list just simply because it's just so exciting. And it's one of those pieces where you really just want to be sitting right next to the players while they're playing it, to feel it, to hear all those intricate notes as so many of them zip by so quickly, but also to feel it, to feel the bow on the string. It's not enough, I think, to be a distance away and just hear it as music. I think it's the kind of music you really feel. Fiona?
I've been lucky enough from really quite, I suppose, teenage really, to have heard the six Bartok quartets in maybe a cycle of 2 concerts or however they were done. And that's been for me always the way I've wanted to listen to them. I've probably very rarely listened to them as recordings. It's something about, exactly as we've all been saying, this physicality about them, and also this, one has a whole movement in pizzicato, and you have to you sense the energy of and it must be ferociously difficult to get as precisely as it has to be played. Robin, question mark. It's I think I feel the same about the Shostakovich 15 Shostakovich quartets, that they really do demand that you're there, if you possibly can be, to listen to them, at least to get to know them. I know not everybody can be, and certainly not now, but that's one of the things I particularly miss, really.
Well, I wonder, Robin, I know with playing a lot of Bartok in orchestras, sometimes the problem, particularly specifically with amateur orchestras, is one of the problems can be that you're concentrating so hard on the difficulties of your own part that sometimes it's hard with Bartok to understand how it fits into the whole. And it's the whole that obviously matters. How does that relate in a quartet? Obviously there's only 4 of you, but how do you have to spend longer working on works by people like Bartok than you would with other composers because of that technical difficulty married with the difficulty of the piece overall?
Well, in a word, yes. I mean, I think Bartok 5 is a tough nut to crack for even the best players. There's so many difficulties in it. I think perhaps one of the reasons I chose this particular one, having just picking up on what Fiona was saying, is that yes, I think it's the nearest I ever came to collapsing after a quartet performance. Often second performances are the most dangerous, because I actually had to learn and play over 100 quartets in my first year with Lindsays, including all 6 Bartoks. And so that was about 3 days to prepare each one.
Wow.
And I think the second performance of Bartok 5, I can remember literally sinking down the wall when I staggered off after it, because I'd come so close to not being able to keep playing. I should just say about the Zeitmeier Quartet, apparently they performed Bartok's 5th Quartet from memory. Now that's a feat that it's completely unimaginable to me. And indeed, I honestly wouldn't want to spend my time doing it. I happen to know the cellist who was involved with the quartet, and she told me that in fact she had a young child at the time, and as a single mom, and I think she learnt Bartok 5 from memory between about 5 o'clock in the morning, over a number of months.
Wow.
Extraordinary story that. I hope she wouldn't mind me mentioning it. So the other thing I would just say about it is that yes, it's very abrasive music, exhilaratingly so, and yet it should be approached really almost in many respects like playing Mozart or Beethoven or whatever else. It's not cut off from that heritage, and it works an awful lot better if you don't just sort of play it very abrasively and percussively, even though of course it's got that element as well. And so that involves also very much, the classic quartet skills of how you match both strokes, how you balance things together, all this sort of thing. Yeah.
Richard, another choice from you.
Well, I was going to go, and my choice of Bartok would have been the sixth, but because I think absolutely, I think my personal favourite would be the fifth, like Robin says. The sixth was one that we just about, in our amateur way, after weeks of practice, managed to sort of scrape through to a standard where we could convince ourselves it's recognisable. But also, there's this idea of Bartok as being spiky, as being intellectual, as being all that stuff. It doesn't stand up when you listen to a sixth quartet. It's absolutely charged with sorrow and emotion, written in 1939. Every single movement begins with the moving mesto, sad, and it's this sort of unifying theme. And it's essentially a huge elegy, deeply, deeply felt, with all the brilliance and intellectual power of Bartok, all that zingy, spicy, tangy, folk-flavoured dissonance, but just this overwhelming veil of sadness. And that, of course, was his last quartet. So he didn't intend it to be his last quartet, apparently. He was planning to write another one in exile. But, well, I was going to skip Mozart and Beethoven, because I assumed other people would deal with them, and also because I see it, they are School of Haydn, one way or another, in a massive way. We can come back to those later. I was just going to plunge right into the Romantic era and put my cellist cards down on the table here and say Borodin's second quartet, which it's sort of almost too well known, I think, to almost count as an intellectually credible choice. I'm a cellist, though. The viola and the second violin lay down that sort of syncopated, quiet accompaniment at the beginning, and off you go with this glorious, glorious melody. Borodin was a cellist himself. He knew how to write for the instrument. It all lies under the hand. That melody, the glorious melody of the nocturne, a slow movement, but it's just pure pleasure to play. You see that on the stand, and you just know you're going to have fun as a cellist, of course. But I think there's another important point about the Borodin second quartet is that there's this assumption there is this what we call the phrase I always hate is the core German classics, as if there is this sort of agreed central line of Western classical music, and everything that's German is correct and proper and impressive, and everything else is a kind of secondary afterthought or kind of exotic spin-off from that tradition. Borodin is essentially creating a tradition from scratch in Russia. And the thing about the second quartet, I mean, it's present there in the first quartet, I don't think with quite the same level of melodic inspiration, is the way he reinvents the quartet sound. He is an amateur composer working in his spare time, surrounded by folklorists and eccentrics and aristocrats. He was himself a chemistry professor, just writing music that I think he wanted to play with his friends and for the circle he moved in. And he invents this completely original sound world. There's sort of transparency to this, to the texture, sort of way of using instruments. I say bringing a cello and viola up front like that, sort of making it glow. There's a sort of sweetness of the sonority. It was a way of using techniques like pizzicato and sort of tremolando and harmonics, sort of the glinting sound of the string harmonics, to create this kind of fantastically colourful, jewelled, rich, distinctly Russian sound. It's like a sort of Fabergé. It's like a sort of Fabergé quartet, almost, a second. And this is all very nice. I mean, there's a fantastic passage in the Nocturne, which I think it was in the old Penguin Companion to a String Quartet. The writer, I think it may have been Calvo Caresi, said it's almost, I think it was a cello's quiet pizzicato, the viola is tremolando, the violins are sort of playing the melody in a canon high above. And he said it's as if Chopin could score for string quartet. This is the kind of sound he would have created. And all this sounds very nice, very luxurious, but the point is, he was followed by Glazunov. Glazunov taught Shostakovich and Prokofiev, and those techniques, that particular way of putting a quartet together, of inventing new sounds, that particular luminosity, clarity, and sort of spaciousness that Borodin pioneers in a second quartet is basically a root of that entire tradition. You hear it echoing through, certainly through all the Shostakovich quartets by way of Glazunov. So that sort of Borodin second is, to coin another well-known, to borrow another well-known phrase about Russian music, it's the acorn from which a mighty oak tree grew.
Mm-hmm. Fiona, let's move on to another choice from you.
I suppose my equivalent of Richard's Borodin is one that you've already mentioned, which is the Smetana from My Life, first quartet, which is also rapturous in its emotion and melody, and opens, as Robin will describe when I've had my say, with a most wonderful viola tune, viola solo, and it has the fact which is always mentioned, and I hesitate to mention it again, but I think that not everybody knows about his deafness and the signal to his tinnitus in the final movement, when there's suddenly a high, very high harmonic that pierces into this very sensuous melodic music. But it's a great piece, and it's just wonderful to listen to, and has all the elements that Richard so appreciates in the Borodin. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to hear Robin talk about that opening viola tune. You must think, oh, good.
Absolutely, yeah, no, it's a great moment, there's no doubt. I mean, I think the thing about the Smetana Quartet, and it used to be one of the most popular quartets early in the 20th century, actually. It's not quite as often played today as it used to be. I wonder whether people find it almost too heart on sleeve. And it shares that with the Borodin, I suppose. I mean, I just think it's absolutely wonderful, because the outpouring of this deeply felt emotion, and the way he switches between his very tragic utterances, because there was a lot of tragedy in his life. Indeed, I mean, the second quartet is one of the most extraordinary in the whole repertoire, because it was written while he was in a mental institution. He'd been forbidden to compose, and there's a very, very heartrending letter in which he says that when he came back to his music the next day to write it, he'd completely forgotten what he'd written the day before and had to kind of pick it up again. And you can sense some of this music is so full of emotion that you can sense it's not far off being insane, even in the first quartet. And so to complement the tragic elements, there's this incredible exuberance of a dance in the second movement and so on. I would say it's some of it is phenomenally difficult to play. He's one of those composers who didn't quite understand the string instruments so well. He writes, there are a few places which actually literally cannot be played, as he wrote them. need to be rewritten a little bit, or faked, or whatever. But in fact, when it's properly played, you're not aware of that. Shouldn't be aware of it. But definitely as a player, I was very, very aware of it. I remember. Yeah.
Richard mentioning Borodin takes me to my next choice, because it's not Borodin, but it is Shostakovich, played by the Borodin Quartet. And I know we're supposed to be totally intellectual and maybe not pick the most popular pieces, but I'm going to have to choose the 8th quartet of Shostakovich, because it's just so thrilling and such an extraordinary work. I mean, so much of his music, of course, is autobiographical, but this one just seems another step up in that regard, with the DSCH motif, of course, throughout. But also, it's one of those pieces, I think, it's the one if you're not a string player, you'd love to be a string player in order to play this piece. And I mean, it was premiered by the Beethoven Quartet. But it's really the Borodin Quartet. I think I'm sure Robin would agree that sort of put it on the map really. And I think their recording is still one of the great recordings of that work. It's the one I always turn to. I must tell a little story about it, that when I was at Radio 3 doing my program Music Machine, we spent a week, we did a week of programs with the Lindsays in Sheffield, where of course the Lindsays were resident many times doing their own festival and things. And we were in the small theatre there with some local school children, and we'd spent a week. We did it in a day, of course, but it was a week of programs all about the string quartet and what it was made up of, and some of the great works that were written for it. And in one of the moments, the Lindsays played. You probably remember this, Robin, or maybe not, but you played the fast movement from the 8th Quartet of Shostakovich, and it's kind of what I was saying before about sitting right next to the players and being able to not just hear that music but feel it. That was one of those great moments because everybody really went for it. Peter took it at quite a lick, and it was just thrilling. And what I really remember was the school children were absolutely gobsmacked by it. They'd never heard this music before, and it was quite an experience for them. And I think it remains an experience for me. I find the whole piece just a shattering experience. Really, it's I think it is absolutely my favorite quartet. And so it has to be in my top 5. Robin, I think one of the things, I think that fast movement, for those that are musicians who are listening, a lot of people don't realize that it sounds like it's all semiquavers, but it's actually crotchets, isn't it? It's very, very, very fast crotchets in a bar, which for me, seems like the most difficult bit to get a grip of, more indeed than the notes. The fact that your eyes have to move so fast across the page.
Yes, I mean, it's just why he chose to use that notation. I'm not sure. As you say, it doesn't actually make any difference to how you hear it, fortunately. But you're quite right. Your eyes have to go. And also, for a lot of bars which are endlessly repeated, you might have 40 bars where you play the same thing.
Yes.
So one of the difficulties is, well, until you really know the sound of it very well and can relax, you have to count like blazes, not to come off, to stop in the wrong place. Yes, I mean, it's a visceral piece. It's many people would choose it as their favorite quartet, I think, and it's in a way that's rather extraordinary when you think that he almost intended it as a suicide note. You know, he really saw it as being something that pulled together many threads of his own. It's full of references to earlier pieces and so on. And there's this ambivalence as to whether it actually is a piece about his visit to Dresden to see the effects of the bombing, or whether actually the coded message was much more about, you know, the knock on the door of the Stasi, not the Stasi, the secret police in Russia, and all his feelings about that terrible regime. It doesn't really make any difference because it relates to any of those things that are meaningful to you. And I suppose it's this, why would one choose a piece which is virtually suicidal? Well, I mean, it's full of energy, and it's so heartfelt, I think. It must be a combination of things of that sort. Yeah, completely agree.
Was Shostakovich in anyone else's lists?
I think he was there collectively. I felt he has to be there as someone we absolutely have central to our discussion. But I suppose I would have perhaps also chosen the 8th, but I as I had already said, I like the whole cycle, really.
Richard?
Though it's central to 20th century repertoire. It's astonishing, and the space, sort of emotional space that's traversed over those 15 quartets from the first, which is this kind of almost sunny neoclassical kind of thing, C major, through to this astonishing sort of death songs, these sort of haunted, desolate late works, and then in between you have this, as you say, the 8th, this volcanic. There's a masterpiece that broke through, the one string quartet in the 20th century that really has absolutely found an audience. So much so that, much to my personal immense irritation, people keep doing string orchestra versions of it and sticking in percussion parts and horrible, unspeakable things like that, which you can absolutely understand. The music is so immediate, passionate, so exciting that you understand why you hear it. Conductors want to get their bucky hands all over it, you know.
Well, this
people
is
want to put them in big halls and hear it with big audiences, and I can understand that, but it does lose something, I think.
This is the Rudolf Barschai arrangement, I think, isn't it, for string orchestra of the Eighth Quartet?
He didn't stop there though. He went on and sort of messed up a whole load of Shostakovich quartets.
But Robin, but why doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't work for me as a string orchestra piece. Is it because perhaps it loses its intimacy? Because suddenly you've got a lot of musicians, whereas there is something so powerful, when we started this podcast, it's something powerful about those four individuals playing as one.
Yes, I think it does lose some of the intimacy because you can't shape the melodic lines with the individuality and the nuance that you can if you're a solo player. I have to say actually that I secretly I do rather enjoy the string orchestra version of this piece. I think it's more successful, say, than the arrangement that Mahler made of Schubert's Death and the Maiden, which I really find suffers from the impossibility of giving the personal expression to the lines that you do in a string quartet version. And of course, there's also a version for string orchestra of the Opus 131 Beethoven Quartet, which incidentally is I'll let slip, as I couldn't avoid putting that in my choice. So yes, you lose intimacy, you gain a certain well, just the sheer dynamic and the percussive power of the piece. So for me, it's definitely got its compensations for what's lost.
Okay, well, you've teed up Beethoven. Why don't you introduce it to us now?
Beethoven, yes. Well, I mean, when I was first thinking what to choose for these 5 pieces, I mean, there are certain pieces like Death and the Maiden, which would be so obvious to choose. And in the end, I thought, well, I won't. But I somehow had to include Op 131. I mean, Beethoven, even more than Haydn or alongside Haydn, I'm just not going to try and put one beyond the other. You know, simply the central quartet writers. And I think Beethoven hinted that this was his favourite. He wrote in a letter about it. It was one of the late quartets, of course. It was actually the penultimate one that he wrote. And he writes this wonderful self-deprecating letter, a little bit less lacking in fantasy than some others, words to that effect, and said that he'd found a new way of part writing in the quartet. So, I mean, many composers since have written about this, and I think Wagner said it was the most tragic piece of music that he'd ever heard in his life, the opening fugue. And yet it's a complete universe, you know, from the most tragic music you've ever heard. You've got the most playful and extraordinary presto scherzo kind of movement, which is completely crazy. And it's also, my own belief is it's got a kind of visual impact. You know, we've been talking, especially Fiona, about how important it is to be up close to a quartet. There's a passage in that scherzo, for instance, where there's a relatively serene line going on in the first violin and the cello as well. And in between, he's written an almost unplayable accompaniment for the second violin and the viola, in which they keep jumping very, very fast between the bottom string and the top string. And he must have known perfectly well that it would have been extremely stressful. And just to watch, you know, you've got the first violins leaning back, playing serenely, and the middle players sort of like with their arms going up and down like this and having a terribly difficult time with it. And so, I mean, I think my guess is that he had a sort of visual wit to that, which is very unusual actually in quartet writing, I'd say. But I mean, that's just a tiny moment. And I mean, so many features. I mean, for instance, he introduced playing ponticello with this kind of glassy sound, very, very near the bridge, which when you hear that in this presto, again, it just gives you that moment of disbelief, suspension of belief. What on earth is this? It sounds like Bartok actually, because you sort of almost lose touch with the notes going on behind it. Absolutely astonishing. 7 movements. Although one of them is really a kind of a sort of transition or an introduction. Another thing that is astonishing about the piece is that we're so used to Beethoven completing his works in a kind of grand fashion, you know, saying, yes, we really have reached the final key. this piece is the only work of Beethoven's that I know personally, you can think of, and probably I may well be missing some, where you're left with the sense of shock, as if he hadn't really found a way to complete the work properly, that it should have, it sounds actually, if we're being technical, like the dominant of F sharp minor, because he's finished on a C sharp major chord. And it just kind of dwindles away, and you just sort of, it's as though he'd just become exhausted. He just couldn't fight the fight anymore. He couldn't resolve it. And in fact, there's a sketch which suggests that he considered writing an eighth movement to this piece, as if seven wasn't enough, and abandoned it. And the eighth movement found its way into his last quartet, Opus 135, which is in D flat major, which is the same as C sharp major. And the whole of that quartet actually I see as a kind of resolution to the Opus 131 C sharp minor quartet, as if this was an unresolved work, and he had to write a complete new work to complete it. You'll have to stop me, Tommy, because I could go on about indefinitely. But just to say that it really, if there was one quartet ever written that contains as much of human life as you could imagine, it would have to be that. And for that reason, I think I just had to choose it.
Yeah, I had 131 on my list too. I first heard it live with the Tokash Quartet doing it at Wigmore Hall, because I was filming it, and so I had to learn the piece a bit because I was directing it, and that was quite a major experience for me, because I didn't really know the piece, if I'm honest, at all. And then looking at the score, which of course is a very different experience to just sitting and listening to a piece. Particularly, I think, with 131, where you look at it and you think, what on earth is this? What's going on? Why is this happening? What's that doing there? I think even more than just listening to what's happening. It's an amazing thing to do, to look through that score. Fiona, Beethoven.
Absolutely. I'm very glad that Robben has saved me from having to make a choice of the late quartets, because I can't. I don't know what it is about them. I know every note. I know what's going to come next, and yet I find them the hardest to talk about, because they are so. Everything Robben said, they each contain a world. It is, each instrument has the personality of any human being you'd ever come across. Changing, fickle, humorous, dark, all within the same breadth. And just when you think this cannot get any bleaker, this little joke comes in, and it is how life is. And it always is, when people say about chamber music or quartets especially being conversation, I think if you haven't really encountered this repertoire, you don't really know what on earth are people talking about. But if you get inside this music, even if not with the incredible expertise of a performer and musician like Robben, you do think Beethoven understood the whole of life, and he really was like Shakespeare. He could just do it all. The virtuosity of the thought and the imagination it's so moving. I thought, because I can't just talk coherently, as you can see, about the late quartets, I thought I'd say Opus 59, number 3, one of the middle quartets, which is I think all the quartets, Opus 18, the middle period ones, and the late are full of richness and vitality and invention. But Opus 59, number 3 is hugely symphonic as a piece, and full of fury and energy and smiles and all the things you ask of Beethoven, and great fun to play, however badly, in my case, not in Robben's.
Richard, another choice from you.
I just want to talk about Dvorak, a viola player, which is always a good quality with a string quartet writer. I think he wrote about 14 or 15 string quartets in total, possibly 16. You sort of hear him finding his feet throughout the cycle. He sort of hits his form, and when he hits his form, it has a sort of freshness and openness. It has all those Haydn-like qualities, as well as being very, very informed by a romantic sensibility. There's sort of slight nationalist elements, which I think are a bit overplayed. But essentially, it's enormous freshness, enormous warmth, enormous and the work I particularly love most of all the Dvorak quartets, which is the Opus 51 quartet in E flat. An incredible intimacy and warmth, tenderness, and sense of humour as well. I mean, it's so hard to choose with Dvorak. The American quartet is the well-known one. Very good reasons why. It's superbly written, incredibly clear, consistently inspired. Every effect comes off. Every melody is memorable. Two late quartets, Opus 105 and 106, which are as rich and as complex as anything you'll find in the late Romantic period. But then this other one, this little early one, which is where I think he really sings his heart out, which is Opus 51. But it just opens with this lovely rocking motif. It sort of swells up from the bottom of the ensemble. It sounds like a sort of a harmonium wheezing or a cradle rocking or a lullaby. And the melodies just seem to grow out of that and gradually start to dance. And so out of this, he builds this glorious sonata movement. The slow movements, which he calls a romancer, is just, again, he uses the textures of the string quartet so brilliantly, sort of rippling pizzicato at the beginning of these sort of double stopped chords. So again, it sounds like a harmonium or perhaps even an accordion very gently, just sort of wheezing away. And then the finale, which is just fantastic, skittering, hilarious, uproarious rondo of a folk song. And it all lies under the hand. It all feels natural. It all feels fresh. It all feels intimate. It doesn't feel like he's talking to a big crowd. It feels like this is, the music of friends is what the great cliche about chamber music, and this always really, really feels that way to me. There's an immense humanity and warmth about it, and it's a lovely, lovely piece. So I always sort of gets me a bit weepy when I play it.
Fiona, Dvorak?
Yeah, well, of all the Dvoraks, that was my choice as well. It shows a different side to Dvorak from the one that we tend to think we all know, which is the sort of jolly person who went and did train spotting and other lovely things. But this is I think there's some more. There's a struggle in there as well, and I think it's a very poignant and tender piece.
Robin, let's get to your next choice. Is this your fourth choice?
Yes, so I'm going to go to Brahms, who only wrote 3 quartets. In fact, he wrote many, many more, but he destroyed them all. I mean, somewhere out there, I think there are anything up to about 20 quartets, which he ripped up, which is a tantalizing thought. The first 2 are quite symphonic and heavy-going, wonderful, wonderful music, A minor and C minor. The one I've chosen is not played so often, and it's the B flat major. He wrote it when he was struggling with the First Symphony. He described it as a useless trifle to avoid facing the serious countenance of the symphony. And he dedicated it to a friend of his who was a cellist, an amateur cellist. And he said, "This quartet resembles your wife, very dainty but brilliant." And then an even more extraordinary remark, because referring to the symphony that he was obviously having such difficulties bringing into being. And he says, in the case of this quartet, it's no longer a question of a forceps delivery, but of simply standing by. And I think this captures wonderfully this idea, the effortlessness. And I mean, I love Brahms, but there's no doubt he was a serious guy a lot of the time, had a huge heart, but there's often this sense of Beethoven standing on his shoulders, and you feel that with the earlier quartets. And you feel it with the symphony as well, and somehow this sense of Beethoven just having no agenda, just allowing his genius to pour out, and thoroughly enjoying it because he didn't have to prove himself or anything. And so the music is so full of imagination, so full of things that, again, I mean, you can say almost every fine quartet is unique and unlike any other, but I mean, he really finds ways of writing for quartet which have never been achieved before or since, and he has such fun with it, and it's very Mozartian in the sense that he just brings out these wonderful melodies. He also does the most absurd rhythmic tricks with it. He just plays. There's some bars where you really could hardly work out what he's doing rhythmically, so that's fun as well. And these lovely kind of magical shifts of harmony and tonality, as if he's just sort of sidestepped. And indeed, I realised that that's a quality of the other piece, which my final 5th piece, which I'll mention probably quite soon, sidestepping into another emotional world without really fighting your way to get there, but just simply stepping there, and you're just suddenly there. I suppose I ought to mention that the 3rd movement is possibly the big viola movement of all the quartet repertoire, because the entire thing is basically a viola melody. And what's more, he asks the other three instruments to play with their mutes on, which allows obviously the viola to sing through more. I'm not sure whether I would like to say it's essential, but it definitely creates a colour where the accompaniment is just supporting suddenly the viola in the limelight there. So that's a great thing. I listened to the Amadeus Quartet recording of this just this morning, actually, just to remind myself. And I think if you want to go back to the Amadeus, I think their Brahms is among their greatest. I think it wears better than some of their earlier repertoire. And I mean, I thought this was the most fabulous performance, I must say, full of virtuosity, but so much tenderness and beautiful nuance and rubato, especially from Norbert Weiner and so on. So it's a slightly unusual choice, but it's a piece I absolutely love, and it brings the joys of spring, if you like, and it's a welcome relief from heavier concerns.
One of the pieces that was mentioned quite a lot when I asked the question of top 5 string quartets on social media is the Tchaikovsky third quartet. I don't know whether anyone was close to choosing that, but it come up a lot, actually. Robin, Tchaikovsky third?
Yes, it's got the most incredible slow movement. I mean, really, E flat minor, I think, if I remember rightly. Very, very, it almost makes you think of the Pathétique or something, really, as you'd expect, deeply, deeply felt. I think it's probably the third, perhaps the best of the three. I actually love number 1. Number 2 is so symphonic that it's got some wonderful music in it, but it is quite a slog. No, I think number 3 has got some wonderful music in it. Yes.
I'm going to throw in my last choice. There was some mention of Death in the Maiden, Schubert, throughout. It's not that piece, but it is that piece is referenced in this work, and that is George Crumbs' Black Angels, which is one of those pieces that when I first heard it absolutely knocked me sideways. My mum is a big fan of George Crumbs' work, and that's how I came to it initially at home. And I mean, I love a lot of George Crumbs' music, but this is the one, and actually it's really also connected to so much to the performance by the Kronos Quartet, who've did a recording of it. Did the first recording of it, of course. And I've also heard them do it live, and it's as much about the performance as it is about the music, I suppose, in a way, with that piece. It creates such an extraordinary atmosphere, written in the very beginning of the 70s, at a time of war. It's very much, I think, about the Vietnam War. And as I say, references Schubert, Death in the Maiden, but it's just one of those visceral experiences again. I mean, just from the get-go, the very opening notes, make your ears prick up and you stand up almost straight with this very discordant, very screechy sound and the highest points of the instruments, just to get your attention. And it's from that moment on, it just absolutely grips me with it's more, I suppose it's the atmosphere of the piece as much as anything, as is so often the case with George Crumb, creating these worlds, often these huge worlds out of these tiny number of instruments. So I would always want Black Angels in my top 5. And you seem to be agreeing with me, Fiona.
Yes, I am. I'm sort of galloping through Debussy, Ravel, Janacek, Schubert, all sorts of others. And I did land on just a sense of wanting to have something more recent. That's the piece that stands out for me. It just conjures a time when they were particularly concerned with the horrors of Vietnam, but it speaks to any time. But it's very visually, orally visual and visually oral, if you see what I mean. You can hear the sort of the bombers coming. It's a frightening piece, but it's got poetry in it as well.
Well, and connected with that in a way, I was going to also choose Different Trains by Steve Reich, but we talked about that in a previous edition of the podcast when we talked about works since 1980. But that's another piece that I think has a huge emotional impact for me, and is another quartet piece that has other elements to it. In this case, of course, tape. with sounds of trains and many other things too. Let's go over to Richard for another quick choice from him.
Well, this is a discovery for me of the last few years, and perhaps it shouldn't have been, but it is. And I'm pleased to say a composer who's getting heard a lot more now is Kreutzer, the Polish composer, who wrote a phenomenal cycle of string quartets that she wrote between the late 1930s and the mid 1960s, I think. Polish composer, obviously working under communism and dealing with the Nazi occupation and career, a virtuoso violinist who wrote this extraordinary cycle of quartets which combines sort of all the elements of a lot of 20th century style, sort of neoclassicism, sort of drive and energy of neoclassicism, the clarity of sort of then moving towards a more avant-garde direction after the war, comparable to say Lutosławski and Penderecki, then kind of moving back from that, and throughout it all, as well as maintaining this incredible clarity, sense of purpose, sense of string style, very present there. Really, always really resonates. A sense of wit and playfulness. I think she's perhaps one of the few composers since in the 20th century who do a Haydnesque finale really well, with wit, with playfulness. And listening through the cycle for the first time, when I sort of, this fantastic new set of recording came out from the Silesian Quartet in Chandos about 3 or 4 years ago now. There's also a cycle on Naxos, which is also excellent. And listening through the cycle, there came this moment, I think I listened to the first and second quartet and I thought this is an interesting composer, attractive voice. Third quartet, suddenly it's all locked into place, and it's like, this is a stone cold masterpiece. Everything works. Everything is effective. It's speaking with absolute assurance, with a distinctive voice, saying something with absolute economy of means, and at the same time such a generosity of imagination. It sounds like a string quartet. It sounds classical. At the same time, it sounds utterly modern. It couldn't come from any other period. Absolutely extraordinary work. I was lucky enough to hear her fourth quartet performed by the Silesian Quartet at the Hall last year, and it's first chance I've had to hear her music live, and it certainly lived up to expectations. All that playfulness, all that energy. It's on a program with 2 Szymanowski quartets, and it more than stood up next to them. And why this composer is not better known, I'm not sure. When we discussed the CD cycle on Chandos for a potential award that I was on the panel for, I got taken to task by some of the hardline modernists on the panel, who said that, well, it's clear that sort of in around her fifth quartet, she's moving towards Ligeti, she's moving towards Lutosławski, but then she moves back from it and does something different, and that's not right. You're meant to get more dissonant as you get more modern, and so we can't really take it seriously. And I said, well, it's clear. She tried it, she did something with it, she moved on. It didn't work for her. She found a different path, and that path is very, very clear in her music. And I just think it's a really fascinating voice. And that third, if every quartet doesn't have that in its repertoire in 10 or 15 years' time, I'd be very surprised.
There you go. Quartets out there, you've been told. Robin, let's go to your last choice.
Well, in a way, I've been very boring. I've fallen into this trap of going largely with the central German Viennese repertoire. I just love Mozart, and again, perhaps at these crazy times, I've looked for transcendence, something that takes me out of it. Mozart famously wrote 6 quartets, which he dedicated to Haydn, and talked about what a hard labour it was to produce them. And they're wonderful works, but I've always loved the final 3 quartets, which are known as the Prussian Quartets, because he dedicated them to the King of Prussia. I think he was hoping to get a lot of money out of him, but I think it all went wrong in the end. But the fact is, this quartet, which is in B flat major, Köchel 589, is a sort of, it's got this incredible fragile beauty to it. It's exquisite. It's effortless. It's heavenly. It's full of. It's happy but tinged with sadness. It's got these incredible transparent textures and lovely harmonic shifts, and a little bit like I mentioned in the Brahms as well, where you just suddenly get transported into a magical new world and then back again, and outpourings of melody, wonderful transparency of texture, and again a wonderful kind of democracy of the quartet, because although the King of Prussia was a cellist, and he therefore wanted to please the king by writing great cello solos, and he certainly did, being Mozart, he rather actually gave everybody solos, and so these are sometimes known as the Mozart solo quartets as well. It's a completely different way of writing quartets than he used in the earlier ones. And if, for anybody who hasn't heard them, the word that comes to me is just exquisite, really, and transcendent. I just love it. Oh, and very importantly, extraordinary. This is the only quartet I know where the minuet and trio is longer than any of the other movements. It's a completely extraordinary minuet and trio, especially the trio. It lasts about the whole movement lasts over 7 minutes, and I think the first movement is the nearest, and that's about 6.5. So he just suddenly goes to town on it. His inspiration lets fly, and it's complete magic. And the best moment of all for me is a sequence which takes you back to the tune at the end of the trio, in which you know what's coming, you know you're on the way home, but it's as though he just carries you on a cloud, a heavenly cloud of this wonderful textures, sort of like a tapestry or a kind of mosaic of complicated but delicate ornamentation, I suppose, which just does for me every time I hear it, actually. So you can hear I'm very enthusiastic. And the last movement is just like a whole bunch of kids let out of school, incredibly full of energy, just bouncing around, mischievous, irrepressibly playful, brimful of energy. So if this is one you don't know, I'd strongly recommend it.
Robin, while I've got you here, I did want to go sort of to the other end of things and ask you about Michael Tippett, because actually Tippett's quartets are mentioned a lot as in the social media little survey I did as well, people picking out his quartets as being important. You played all these great works as a quartet in the Lindsays, but you did work with composers too, and obviously you were very heavily associated with Michael Tippett's quartets. What was it like working with a composer on a piece rather than just playing a piece?
Well, I mean, needless to say, it was different with every composer. My experience was quite often that it was only when I asked a composer, well, what were you thinking of when you wrote this? Why did you do that? And he would explain it in words. And then I would say, oh, I see what you're getting at now. But that never really satisfied me, because I felt that if I couldn't get it from listening to the music and needed to have it explained verbally, I was less happy with that. With Michael Tippett, I mean, the most remarkable experience that we were fortunate to have was he wrote the fifth quartet for us. In fact, he wrote the fourth quartet for the Lindsays. That was before I joined them. And it's a monster of a piece. It's really, really difficult and very strange. Tippett himself, after the first performance, said, "Strange piece that," as if he hadn't written it. But the fifth quartet was, he was, I think he was about 80 when he wrote it. And when we played it to him for the first time, you could see he was living every moment of it, almost in anticipation. You could, just by watching his face as we were playing it, you could see exactly what he meant and how he'd felt it. And it was very, very touching. And of course, famously, he remained very youthful to the end. I mean, he wore the most extraordinary socks, or didn't wear socks at all, would sort of throw himself over the back of the sofa and things in a very boyish manner. But no, I mean, there was a complete sense that he knew exactly why he'd written what he wrote. And there is a link between the last of his quartets and the last of Benjamin Britten's quartets. I mean, Britten's quartet was, of course, actually the last piece he wrote. Tippett wrote The Rose Garden, a beautiful, beautiful work for orchestra.
Rose Lake, sorry, thank you.
But nonetheless, this got that unmistakable feeling of a quartet who knows, of a composer who knows that he's close to the end of his life, and certainly the end of his creative life. And it comes through in a very poignant and beautiful way.
I have to say, the Lindsays did a cycle of the Tippetts at the Adrian Boult Hall in Birmingham, I remember, when I was at the BBC. And actually, because I've always found Tippett really hard to get into, but though it was the performances that did it for me. It was the performances that persuaded me, being there. And again, hearing that music close up, and it opens it up. And suddenly that, and actually I think from what Fiona's been saying about the idea of listening to a cycle rather than just an individual quartet, actually hearing the cycle and hearing, oh, that awful word journey everyone uses now, from one to the end, it actually is quite a powerful experience, that with Tippett's works, I think. Any other very quick ones to throw in? Just let me just mention a few that were mentioned on my little online poll here that a few people put in. The Dvorak American was mentioned quite a bit. Jana Intimate Letters, Beethoven 15, Debussy, Ravel. I mean, we haven't talked about the Ravel, but the Ravel remains a very, very popular work. Tom Addis, Accordiana, Grosse Fuge, gosh, I mean, there's so many. Ligeti 2, Elliott Carter 1, Bartok 4, Tchaikovsky 3, as I mentioned, is mentioned a lot here. There's a lot of quartets out there that a lot of people feel very passionately about, and Borodin mentioned many times as well. Richard in there. Any others to throw in? Some quick ones to throw in that we haven't mentioned, Fiona?
The Janacek Kreutzer Sonata, the first Janacek quartet, is one that I would have liked to mention.
Richard?
I'm one of the few people in the world who loves Verdi's Only String Quartet. It's a fantastic piece. Also want to mention, because we haven't done that much 20th century stuff, the string quartets of the American avant-gardist Ben Johnston, who died last year, which are extraordinary. His sixth quartet is a single 20-minute movement written without bar lines in microtones, believed for 3 decades to be unplayable, and has now been recorded by the Kepler Quartet. And when you sort of listen to his other quartets, when you spend time in his sound world, it actually makes perfect and fascinating musical sense. I think it's a masterpiece.
And I'm going to throw in Xenakis, a piece called Tetris, which the Arditi String Quartet played at the Cheltenham Festival in 1995. And wow, the looks are, I mean, people who go to an Arditi String Quartet concert presumably know what they're going to get. But I think there were a number of people in the Cheltenham Pitville Pump Room who weren't absolutely sure that this is what was going to meet their ears that day. And looking out and seeing the expressions was fabulous. You know, the most impressive thing I remember about that day, seeing Irvin Arditi arrive in his Porsche 911. I thought to myself then, wow, there really is money to be made in contemporary music, and I've never forgotten it. But that was an extraordinary performance. I mean, wow. Because of course the Arditis absolutely live that music, throw themselves into it. And that was an amazing experience. Robin? You wanted to come in?
I'm going to just drop in the Lutoslavsky Quartet, which is a visceral piece. It's incredibly exciting to listen to. Definitely better to hear in a live performance for the first time rather than on a recording. Very dissonant. One of the wonderful things about it is that compared with some contemporary composers such as Brian Ferneyhough, he writes it in a way that's comparatively easy to play, because you kind of improvise in boxes. The main thing you have to do is to keep watching to see the signal to move on to your next box. So it sounds as though you're doing the most incredible feat of ensemble playing, and actually you're not at all, but it's all the better for that, I think.
Fiona, you wanted to come in?
Don't let's forget Jonathan Harvey, 4 quartets, wonderful. And we haven't mentioned that we have elsewhere the Elizabeth McConkie quartets.
Yes. Well, as always, there's way too many to mention, really. And thank you, actually, to everyone who's already suggested quartets on social media. I'll continue to read those with great pleasure. But thank you very much, Fiona and Richard, and especially thank you to Robben Island for joining us today. Such a pleasure to see you and hear what you had to say about quartets. Robin, just tell us quickly what you're up to next. I know you're mentioned that you're head of chamber music at Bern Conservatoire, so presumably in lockdown you're doing a lot of online stuff at the moment.
Absolutely, yes. I've become quite an expert with Zoom. I've also abandoned it at times and just asked students to send me recordings so that I can actually, because although Zoom is fine for speech, it really sounds awful for music, to be honest. But, there have been compensations, and I've been very, very warmed by the way the students have also shown enormous sort of dedication in continuing to work really hard and so forth. And for myself, I still play my viola a lot every day. I was hoping to actually do rather more playing in the coming years. I still hope that will be the case. If not, I'm always happy at home playing Bach. I never end. working on Bach, solo Bach.
Well, thank you again, Robin, for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating, as always. Join us next week if you can for another top 5. In the meantime, look out for the Spotify playlist that will support this podcast with some of the great performances of the quartets that we've been concentrating on today. And please do like us on iTunes and on Podbean and on Spotify. That would be lovely. Thanks for your company and see you next week.